Next, we will move to presenter Ramana Dhara, who, if you had a copy of the program, you'd see he has more initials in his name than letters in his name, so that's pretty impressive. He will be talking to us today about the parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant. Dr. Dhara.
Thank you. So, the 6 blind men and the elephant is really what I thought of when I went to the Bhopal disaster. And the Bhopal disaster happens to be the world's worst industrial disaster. Over 15 to 20,000 people died in the disaster. And the number of people who've been injured are probably well over 100,000. And at last count, over 500,000 people were compensated for this disaster. Were all of them injured? We don't know that. But certainly we had a large number of people being compensated. And what has happened is that over time, the Bhopal disaster, which happens, as I said, the world's worst industrial disaster, has just slipped from memory. For whatever reasons, because we've had a number of other disasters that happen. For example, the BP oil spill, which is the worst industrial disaster in the United States. So I was a general practitioner in the southern city of Hyderabad in India when this disaster happened. And I was doing some environmental health kinds of work, and when the disaster happened and all these people were dying in the city of Bhopal, I was asked to come over and take a look and see if I can provide some public health inputs into what would be a good way to investigate this disaster. And when I encountered the different medical professionals and the scientists in Bhopal, I really thought of the 6 blind men and the elephant, because the elephant is the Bhopal disaster, and each person was taking a certain approach to the disaster based on their discipline and based on their agenda, but nobody was talking to each other. And what you needed was these people to talk to each other to find out what the big picture in this disaster was. And as we well know, with disasters, there's a whole range of scientific and political and legal issues that seem to come up. And all of these are interacting with each other and also interfere with each other to prevent this final product of actually providing a healing process for the victims of this disaster. So that's the impression. Now where is Bhopal? Bhopal is one of the central cities in India. It's the capital of Madhya Pradesh, and it's a major rail junction. And it had a population of about 900,000 when this disaster first happened in 1984. That's the Union Carbide factory that you see up in front there. And right now that's dismantled. There's nothing over there. Ever since the disaster happened, it closed down. Obviously, the local people would never allow this company to ever work there again. There was just way too much frustration and anger with the company. What you see here is a rather dramatic situation, because these are the bodies of the gas victims who died after being exposed to this gas that particular night. And unfortunately, the gas was released at 12 o'clock midnight. Most people were sleeping in their beds. And when the gas was released, it went over the local community and literally hugged the local community for about a couple of hours. That means it stayed over there. It entered people's homes, and they were breathing in this gas and got up thinking that somebody was cooking chilies in the neighborhood, and so they got up thinking that was the situation, whereas actually they were asphyxiating. It was extremely irritant to the eyes and to the nose and to the lungs. And this is what woke them up. They panicked and they started running out of their homes. And when they were running, they were breathing in more gas. And so the dose to the lungs actually increased because they were running in this gas cloud. And they were running to the hospitals in the hundreds and thousands. And the hospitals could not handle this volume of patients that were coming in. So they were being triaged in the hospital, and people who were dying right away were just being put on the hospital grounds for identification purposes, because they were not even identified. People were just running into the hospitals for treatment. And when I went there a couple of weeks later, I found that the wards were full of people, the critical care wards were full of people who were breathless, who were extremely sick and dying too. So that's what we saw. Now, not just people, there were animals too. You can see that this was a stable close by, and these large animals breathed in this gas and they died pretty quickly. I mean, it's within a couple of hours' time. The interesting thing was that some of the insects seem to have survived, and nobody can explain why. Flies and mosquitoes, maybe it's their long evolutionary history that has made them resistant to chemical toxins, but they survived this particular disaster. But the large animals died. There was a lot of effect on the trees and the vegetation around there, which all got burnt. And of course, the thing is that this is a disaster which needed a lot of toxicology and a lot of input from science. So I come back to this, and again, here you'll see that the scientists and the medical professionals are blindfolded. So they're each trying to understand this Bhopal elephant from their perspective. So somebody holds the tail and says, oh, it's a rope. But what they should have been doing was understanding that what are the toxins involved in this disaster? The main toxin was methyl isocyanate, an extremely corrosive compound which literally eats away at mucous membranes and human tissues. And what this compound was doing was that it was corroding these mucous membranes and skin of people. And where it went into the eyes fortunately were producing tears. So these people were tearing up tremendously and washing the chemical out of their eyes. Of course, it left behind a few scars in the eyes. But by and large, it preserved the eyes because of this tearing effect. So, I mean, everybody knows that when you have an irritant in your eye, you start tearing, and so that washes away the chemical from your eye. Unfortunately, the same washing effect did not do very well in the lungs, because as soon as the chemical went into the lungs started pouring fluid out in an attempt to dilute the fluid. But that led to a condition called pulmonary edema, where there was a lot of fluid in the lung and people were drowning in their own secretions. And so this was the problem with this methyl isocyanate, a super corrosive toxic compound which killed people and maimed people right away. One of the problems with this was the fact that this compound, even though it is considered a super toxic compound, was never researched and studied to the extent it should have been. So as doctors, we were struggling to understand what the toxicology of this compound would be. How do we treat these people? And we had no answers. The company Union Carbide turned around and said, look, we have not researched this chemical adequately. And we said, why not? You're storing it in huge quantities. It's a super toxic compound, and we don't have the method of treating people. Is there an antidote to this compound? And they said, no, there is no antidote. Well, what do? Well, you just treat it symptomatically. Those are the kinds of answers we were getting. And this led to huge controversies in the Bhopal disaster. There were camps forming as to whether cyanide poisoning was a part of this toxicological spectrum of this compound. Should we treat for cyanide poisoning? Because cyanide poisoning has got an antidote, whereas methyl isocyanate does not have an antidote. So the fights began between the treating physicians as to one camp saying, okay, let's provide the antidote and see if people get better with it. The other camp saying, no, let's not do this. This doesn't work at all. So these kinds of debates and controversies took away from the actual management and treatment, rational management and treatment of these gas victims, unfortunately. So it provided a kind of a red herring, as one might say, to this situation. And that was most unfortunate, in this particular case. Other things that should have been done: a good epidemiological study design to investigate the community, accident analysis, all of these different aspects of the disaster. Rehabilitation, for example. What do we do in terms of long-term rehabilitation for people whose lungs have been scarred, who get breathless? What do we do with the ordinary bicycle vendor who sells his wares in the streets of Bhopal? He cannot bicycle anymore because he's short of breath. Now, what do we do with him? How do we provide him economic rehabilitation? And these kinds of questions were not adequately discussed. In fact, to my thinking, there has not been a single major conference on this disaster from the medical part where all the stakeholders have been brought together to be able to discuss and provide a rational method of treatment and rehabilitation for these gas victims. And the reason for that is exactly what you see in front of you. It's the Bhopal elephant. People are not being able to talk to each other because of the transnational legal problems, the political problems, and of course, funding issues. And I'm going to talk about all these different, the accident analysis, the toxins, toxicology, epidemiology that was required, the treatment of the victims, and the rehabilitation. So, all right. So this disaster, when I saw it in Bhopal, it actually made me leave my practice. And I said, look, I've really got to understand what this thing is. And I've got to understand, and I've got to study. I knew that I was highly underqualified to even begin to understand the spectrum of problems that this disaster had created. I left my practice and I came to study in the United States. And 10 years later, we went back to Bhopal city to do a follow-up study on these gas victims. And the temperature, when we went back, the temperature of the politics and the anger had still not reduced. In fact, in some cases it had increased, because by now the population had become very frustrated with the fact that they were not receiving adequate rehabilitation and treatment from the local government and the private sector medical facilities that existed. So when we went back there, we decided to hold a public meeting with the gas victims to ascertain what their needs are, to ascertain what their problems are. And we spoke with them. They were extremely angry, even with us. And we could understand that anger. So we tried to channel that anger in terms of communication. We wanted to communicate with them what was the purpose that we were there for, what were their needs, and how would we help them, if we could help them at all. We were under no impression that we could actually help these people. Incidentally, we have with us today a Bhopal survivor who actually works at CDC, Dr. Ritu Srivastav, and she's right here. She was studying in Bhopal at the time of the accident, and she's considered a Bhopal survivor. Thank you, Ritu. So many of the questions that were brought up for us were things like, look, are these toxins still prevalent in our body? Why are we feeling these effects? Or all of us have been affected. Why don't you examine all of us? And now we are talking examining 200,000 people. You know, do we have the resources? Do we have the time? Do we have the money? Do we have the people to do all of this? So we answered the question of, look, what are the toxins prevalent in the body? We said, look, the toxins are no longer prevalent in your body. What you're feeling are the residual effects of the toxins. And that's why you're feeling sick. That's why you're feeling bad. But they were getting all kinds of answers like, oh, you know, we are going to give you some chelation therapy to remove all these toxins from your body. And so, you know, medical facilities were making money out of this whole process by telling people all kinds of different stories about the disaster. I mean, each person had their own theory on this, on the chemistry and the toxicology of this compound. So when we went there and we explained to them these simplistic kinds of things that, look, simple therapy is going to help you. For example, I mentioned to you that the chemical had dried the eyes out of these people. It had burnt the tears out of these eyes. People could no longer produce tears. And they were getting this syndrome called the dry eye syndrome. And we said, okay, the way to deal with that is not to do all kinds of antibiotics and expensive medicines. All you need to do is put artificial tears into your eye and you'll feel much better. People understood that. The question of why don't you examine all of us? People were demanding, you know, they were angry. They said, look, I need to be examined. Why don't you examine all of us? We said, we can't do that. But what we can do is provide a good epidemiological study design where we can do a sampling of this population and thereby give you some valid answers based on that sampling. The way we explained to them was that, look, if you cook a pot of rice, you don't need to examine every single grain in this pot to determine whether it's cooked or not. All you need to do is pick up 1 or 2 grains, and that will tell you whether the entire pot of rice is cooked. A light bulb went off in these people. They understood this. They understood the concept of epidemiology from the perspective of cooking a pot of rice. And so this became a very simple method of communication to these people, which made them understand, yes, look, we can understand this. And then they bought into this whole process of the study. They bought into this process of saying, okay, you can now study us. And they helped us with actually finding the different homes where we went in to investigate these people for these problems. They actually helped us with the study design. They said, okay, these are the areas that you should be looking in because this is where people have been most affected. And so we employed this stratification of this population saying, okay, so the people closest to the factory and then 2 kilometers further in 2 kilometers and 2 kilometer distances. And that's the way we did this so that we could get what is called a dose-response relationship in this situation. We also heard interesting stories of how these gas victims had come into the hospitals and they were breathing the gas out, and the hospital staff were breathing the gas in because they were treating these people. And so there was secondary transmission of the gas that was going on from the patients to the doctors, to the nurses, to the hospital staff. And many doctors told us stories about how they themselves became affected because the secondary transmission of gas was happening from the patients. Means that the patients were breathing out large volumes of the gas, and therefore the physicians and nurses were being affected by that transmission of gas. And one of the internal medicine professors actually told me a story that he developed what is called as an aphasic syndrome because he was involved in treating the patients that particular night and he was breathing in the gas. And so he says, now I've developed aphasia where I cannot remember certain things at certain points in time. And every person we met who was involved in the treatment told us stories of this sort. People with skin problems, simply by the fact that they had treated the gas victims. So what we did with this study was we went back to them and we explained to them, these are the findings that we saw. And our findings really were this, that the people who lived closest to the factory were the most impacted. Well, hey, that makes sense, doesn't it? And yet, in these 10 years, nobody had thought of doing a stratified sampling approach, which could provide something like that. So the people who lived closest to the factory were the most affected. Those 2 kilometers away were less affected. And so those who were 6 to 10 kilometers away were the least affected. And this gave us a good, rational, scientific, valid approach to studying this population. And we said, okay, this is the way you've got to continue doing these kinds of studies out here. It turned out that the government had actually registered a cohort of 90,000 people in the city. 90,000 people being examined by a handful of investigators. You're never going to get good data from something like this. And we cautioned them about this. We said, look, please do not have such large populations. But they said, look, this is a political disaster in the sense that if we do not do this, then people will not be satisfied. And these are the balances that you have to make in disasters of this sort. Science is not straightforward. Epidemiology is not straightforward. You cannot do these things as determined by science. You have to go sometimes by a seat of the pants approach. But that's the only way you can sort of approach this problem. There are lots and lots of stories that I can give you on this disaster, but I wanted to give you a little bit of food for thought that the world's worst industrial disaster was the Bhopal disaster, and they got compensated about $450 million around the mid-90s, which ultimately led to about $500 per person, where if you were injured, and $3,000 per person if somebody in your family had died. So that was how these people were compensated. And people brought up the issue when the United States had its worst industrial disaster, the BP oil spill. There was immediately $20 billion which was taken as a fund for future treatment and rehabilitation of people. And remember, there's nobody who died in the BP oil spill, whereas you had 20,000 deaths in the Bhopal disaster. So this was like an unequal dispensation of justice, even though there are 25 years separating the two disasters. But this is just food for thought, and this is the way that the disasters are treated. Each of them is different in terms of the politics, in terms of where it occurs, and the fact is that both of them are foreign companies. The BP company is foreign to the United States, and Union Carbide is foreign to India. So in that sense, they're analogous, but different situations.
Thank you. Getting close. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for that. My question for you is sort of a follow-up question. I'm going to hand you this microphone. The other one quit working. So, BP has been a lot in the news in this country. What happened to Union Carbide? Did they disappear? What happened to the company?
Union Carbide pulled a disappearing act, like a lot of companies do. They sold off to Dow Chemical, and they didn't exist as an entity anymore. They gave the compensation of $450 million and then said, okay, we have nothing more to do with this. But it turns out that they left behind a lot of hazardous waste on the premises of the Union Carbide factory. And this hazardous waste is still sitting there. There are tons and tons of hazardous waste still sitting there. And that has now gone into the groundwater system, and it has appeared in the drinking water wells of the city. So now the residents are facing a double whammy. They've been exposed in 1984, and now there's a chronic exposure of persistent organic pollutants, which is continuing in this groundwater. So, so the legacy is still continues to be a problem, and I think that 30 years later, the fight over who's going to clean this up is continuing, because neither the company, Union Carbide, nor Dow Chemical has taken responsibility for this. The CEO of Union Carbide is currently a fugitive from justice. He's supposed to appear in a court in India, but he's not showing up there. So while we try to do our best in terms of trying to heal the population from a medical perspective, there are many, many, many aspects of legal relief which are still to be provided.
Thank you, Dr. Dhara.
Thank you.